Imagine a major city, home to 300,000 people, vanishing from the map in a single heartbeat. No warning, no screams, just a terrifying, absolute silence. In Tokyo, the Imperial High Command stared at their dead telegraph lines in a cold sweat. They thought it was a technical glitch, but the reality was far worse. Hiroshima had been erased. From 30,000 feet, a single plane had just rewritten the rules of human existence. The Japanese generals were still sharpening their swords for a ground war, while the Americans had already harnessed the power of the sun. This is the moment the world entered the atomic age, and the moment the Japanese Empire realized they weren't just losing a war, they were facing total extinction. The Silent Horizon. When the map lost a city, August 6, 1945, 08:15 a.m. The history of warfare is defined by noise. The roar of cannons, the whistle of falling bombs, the screams of the battlefield. But the most terrifying moment in human history began with an absolute haunting silence. At 8:16 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the Japanese Imperial High Command in Tokyo didn't hear an explosion. They heard nothing. The telegraph lines to Hiroshima, the vital nerve endings of the Empire's military communications, suddenly went dead. In an instant, a major industrial and military hub, home to over 300,000 souls, vanished from the grid. There was no report of a massive air raid, no warning of a 1,000-bomber fleet, just a digital and electrical void. This was not a tactical failure. It was the first evidence of a new godlike power that had just rewritten the rules of existence. The command in chaos, the illusion of order. In the war rooms of Tokyo, the generals and admirals scrambled. Their maps still showed Hiroshima as a fortified stronghold, a city of steel and soldiers. But the reality was that those maps were now obsolete. The High Command was operating in a ghost world. They sent desperate inquiries to the neighboring cities. What happened to Hiroshima? Is there a fire? Is there a storm? The responses were even more chilling. Reports came back of a strange light seen from hundreds of miles away, followed by a pressure wave that shattered windows across the horizon. But no one knew the scale. The military mindset of 1945 could not comprehend a single weapon that could silence a city. They assumed it was a massive sabotage or a fluke in the telegraph lines. They were clinging to an old-world logic in a world that had just been split open by the atom, the lone scout and the pillar of smoke. To solve the mystery, the High Command dispatched a young pilot. His mission was simple: fly to Hiroshima, find the glitch, and report back. He expected to see a city in flames or perhaps a local disaster. Instead, from 100 miles away, his cockpit was flooded with an impossible sight. A colossal, multicolored cloud of dust and radioactive debris was punching through the atmosphere, reaching the stratosphere like a demonic pillar. As he drew closer, the pilot didn't see Hiroshima. He saw a flat, glowing gray wasteland where a city used to be. The landmarks were gone, the people were gone. The very ground was fused into glass. He didn't just see a destroyed city, he saw the end of the world as he knew it. He keyed his radio with a trembling hand to deliver the report that would shatter the Empire's resolve. Hiroshima has ceased to exist. This was the moment the Japanese High Command realized they weren't just losing a war. They were facing an enemy that had harnessed the fire of the sun. The radar ghost, 3 dots on a screen. Hours before the sky over Hiroshima turned into an inferno, the Japanese early warning radar in Shimonoseki had detected a small group of incoming American aircraft. The operators tracked them with cold precision. There were only 3 planes. In the brutal arithmetic of 1945, 3 planes did not constitute a threat. The High Command had become accustomed to the firebombing, massive fleets of hundreds of B-29s that turned cities into ash. To conserve precious fuel and interceptors, the order was given: do not engage. They assumed these were mere reconnaissance flights or weather scouts. This was the Empire's first fatal miscalculation. They were looking for a fleet, but the destruction of their world was carried in a single cargo bay. They didn't realize that the rules of mass destruction had shifted from quantity to a singular, terrifying quality. The bunker of denial, science versus samurai spirit. Back in Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff was paralyzed. When the reports of the vanished city reached the underground bunkers, the generals didn't react with grief. They reacted with disbelief. The scientific advisors were summoned. The military leaders asked, "Is it possible for the Americans to have built an atomic bomb?" The consensus among the Japanese scientists was a confident no. They believed the United States was years away from such a breakthrough. They argued that no nation could refine enough uranium to erase a city in one strike. This denial was a protective shield. If they admitted the bomb was real, they had to admit the war was over. The High Command chose to believe a lie, that a massive chemical explosion or a natural disaster had occurred. They chose to wait for better data, while a radioactive graveyard smoldered in the south. The Enola Gay's shadow, a new kind of hunter. While Tokyo debated, the Enola Gay was already vibrating through the air on its return flight. The crew looked back and saw a sight that no human eyes had ever witnessed. The mushroom cloud was a physical manifestation of a new era, the atomic age. The Japanese High Command's failure to recognize the threat of a single plane was the final nail in the coffin of traditional warfare. The samurai code of face-to-face combat and the kamikaze spirit were rendered irrelevant by a weapon that killed from 6 miles up, untouched and unseen. The generals were still preparing for a ground invasion, sharpening their swords for a final stand on the beaches, unaware that the enemy no longer needed to land to win. The shadow of the B-29 wasn't just over Hiroshima, it was over the very future of the Japanese Empire. The humiliation of ignorance, news from the enemy. While the Japanese High Command sat in their bunkers, paralyzed by a lack of data, the truth didn't come from their scouts or their generals. It came from the airwaves. 16 hours after the explosion, the White House released a prepared statement from President Harry Truman. Shortwave radio signals bypassed the Japanese sensors and cut through the static of the Pacific. The message was a lightning bolt. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The Japanese leaders were stunned. They were learning the fate of their own city from the man who had ordered its destruction. The supreme irony was that the invincible empire was now deaf and blind, while the enemy held a godlike clarity. The war of words, reality versus propaganda. The Japanese propaganda machine, the Information Bureau, tried to contain the fallout. They initially reported only minor damage and told the public that the new type bomb was something to be managed with wet towels and bravery. But behind closed doors, the atmosphere was toxic with fear. Truman's broadcast wasn't just a report, it was an ultimatum. He promised a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. The High Command faced a brutal choice: admit that science had defeated their spirit, or continue the lie. They clung to the hope that the Americans only had one such weapon, that Hiroshima was a one-time miracle. They miscalculated the industrial soul of their enemy, believing that the reign of ruin was a bluff. The psychological fracture, a nation in doubt. As Truman's words spread through the underground networks and reached the ears of the Japanese elite, the psychological foundation of the war effort began to crack. For years, the people were told that the divine wind would protect the home islands. Now they were told that a single bomb had vaporized a regional capital. The High Command realized that the secret they tried to bury in the ashes of Hiroshima was now global news. They were no longer fighting a war of soldiers. They were fighting a war of physics. The samurai were being replaced by the scientists, and the Japanese leaders had no counter-move. They remained in a state of strategic coma, refusing to surrender, waiting for a sign from their own gods while the Americans were already fueling the second bomb. The 3-day illusion, the hope of a singular miracle. Following the news of Hiroshima, a desperate theory took hold within the Japanese Supreme Council. They convinced themselves that the Americans had spent years and billions of dollars to create just one single, miraculous weapon. They gambled on the idea that Hiroshima was an isolated event, a hollow threat designed to force a surrender. They calculated that the reign of ruin was a bluff because no nation could possibly possess a second sun. For 3 days, the High Command sat in a state of rigid defiance, refusing to send a formal response to Truman's ultimatum. They were waiting for the divine wind to save them one last time. But the wind that arrived was not divine. It was made of plutonium and steel, The second flash, Nagasaki and the Death of Hope. On August 9, 1945, at 11:02 a.m., the illusion was shattered. A second B-29, Boxcar, released Fat Man over the industrial hills of Nagasaki. This second explosion was more than just another tragedy. It was a psychological death blow to the Japanese leadership. It proved that the United States didn't just have a weapon, they had an assembly line. When the news reached the Imperial Palace that a second city had vanished, the atmospheric pressure in the war room changed. The debate was no longer about victory or defeat. It was about total extinction. The generals realized that if they stayed the course, every major city in the empire would be systematically erased, one by one, every few days, until Japan was a silent, empty archipelago of ash. The assembly line of apocalypse, the final realization. The horror for the High Command was the cold, industrial efficiency of the enemy. They began to imagine a future where American planes hovered over Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto, waiting for the order to drop the next sun. The Japanese military had prepared for a bloody, heroic defense of their soil, a battle of bayonets and bravery. But there is no heroism in being vaporized from the stratosphere. The realization hit them. The Americans were no longer fighting the Japanese army. They were dismantling the Japanese civilization from a distance where no sword could reach. The samurai spirit was powerless against the industrial production of atomic fire. The clock was ticking, and Nagasaki had just proven that time had run out. The last hope, the diplomatic Mirage. Even after Hiroshima, a powerful faction within the Japanese High Command held on to a final, desperate hope, the Soviet Union. Despite the brutal reality of the war, Japan and the USSR were still bound by a neutrality pact. The Japanese leaders believed they could use Moscow as a mediator to negotiate an honorable peace with the Allies, one that would allow the emperor to stay and the military to avoid total, unconditional surrender. They were waiting for a letter from Moscow that would save the empire. They didn't realize that the letter had already been written, not in ink, but in the movement of thousands of tanks. The midnight invasion. Manchuria in flames. On August 9, 1945, at exactly midnight, the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Over 1 million Red Army troops surged across the border into Manchuria like a tidal wave. The Japanese Kwantung Army, once the pride of the empire, was decimated in days. This was the second atomic bomb in political terms. The High Command was hit by a double catastrophe: the American atomic fire from the sky and the Soviet steel from the north. The realization was cold and final. There was no mediator left. The neutral power they relied on had become their executioner. Japan was now trapped between two superpowers in a race to see who would claim the islands first. The strategic dead end. No exit. The entry of the USSR into the war stripped the Japanese generals of their last excuse to continue fighting. They had prepared for an American invasion, Operation Downfall, where they could bleed the enemy on the beaches and force a negotiation. But you cannot fight a two-front war against an atomic-armed United States and a land-hungry Soviet Union. In the bunkers of Tokyo, the debate reached a fever pitch. Some generals still argued for Ketsugo, the decisive battle for the homeland, preferring that the entire nation of 80 million perish in a glorious death rather than surrender. But for the first time, the political leadership realized that glorious death was no longer a strategy. It was just a shortcut to national extinction. The wall was closing in, and the only way out was a path the empire hadn't taken in over 2,000 years: submission. The deadlock of the gods, a divided council. By August 10, 1945, the Japanese Supreme Council was split down the middle. 3 leaders argued for immediate peace. 3 others, the military hardliners, demanded impossible conditions. The war minister, Anami, insisted that the nation must fight to the last man, woman, and child. The room was thick with the scent of death and the weight of 2 millennia of tradition. In a moment that broke all historical precedent, the prime minister appealed to Emperor Hirohito to make the final decision, the sacred decision. For centuries, the emperor was a silent god, a symbol who reigned but did not rule. But as the atomic shadows deepened over Japan, the god had to speak. The sacred decision: choosing the unendurable. Standing before his generals in the humid darkness of an underground bunker, Hirohito delivered his verdict. He looked at the men who had promised him victory and saw only ruin. He spoke the words that would change history. "I have given serious thought to the situation. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer." He commanded that Japan accept the Potsdam Declaration and surrender. To the generals, this was a spiritual earthquake. Their deity was telling them to lay down their swords. The emperor's decision was based on a terrifyingly simple logic. If they did not stop, the Japanese race would be completely extinguished by the American new bomb. He chose the survival of his people over the pride of his military. The night of the traitors, the Kyujo incident, but the shock was too much for some. On the night of August 14th, as the emperor's surrender speech was being recorded on a phonograph disc, a group of rebel army officers launched a desperate coup. They stormed the imperial palace searching for the recording, determined to destroy it, and force the nation to keep fighting. They murdered the commander of the imperial guard and turned the palace into a battlefield. They were obsessed with Gyokusai, the shattered jewel, the idea that it is better to die together than to live in defeat. For a few frantic hours, the fate of the world hung on a hidden record. But the coup failed. The samurai could not defeat the will of their own emperor. The recording survived, and the voice of a god was about to be heard by the common people for the very first time. The voice of the god, August 15th, 1945, at noon, for the first time in history, the people of Japan heard the voice of their emperor. Across the scorched remains of the empire, millions gathered around radios, bowing low. Hirohito's voice was high-pitched and formal, speaking in an ancient court language that many barely understood. But the message was clear. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. It was the ultimate understatement in human history. He never used the word surrender, but he spoke of enduring the unendurable. He specifically mentioned the new and most cruel bomb as the reason for the cessation of hostilities. In that moment, the thousands of years of samurai tradition were officially buried under the weight of atomic physics. The silence that followed the broadcast was the sound of an entire era ending, the ash of the old world. Signing the end on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the formal surrender was signed. The Japanese delegates, dressed in top hats and formal military tunics, stood before General Douglas MacArthur. The background was not a palace, but the massive gray steel of an American battleship, a symbol of the industrial might that had won the war. As the ink dried on the documents, the sun set on the Empire of Japan and rose on a new world order. The High Command, which only weeks ago had planned to fight to the last man, now stood in silent submission. They had realized too late that you cannot fight a war of the future with the ideologies of the past. The atomic inheritance, a world changed forever. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were no longer just cities, they were warnings. The Japanese High Command's realization that a city could vanish in a second changed the psychology of every leader on Earth. The Hiroshima shock gave birth to the Cold War, the nuclear arms race, and the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. We live in the shadow of that August morning in 1945. The moment the Japanese High Command realized Hiroshima had vanished, humanity entered a permanent state of precarious survival. The atom had been split, the secret was out, and the power to erase civilization was now in human hands. The war was over, but the age of fear had just begun.